Behold the world of the future. Mankind flourishing in the atomic age. Creating the latest advances in technology and super science. Braving the final frontier of the stars. Truly, in the future awaits a world of promise, prosperity, and adventure.
You can't help but be enthralled with Retrofuture. That is to say, the past ideas of what the world of today would be like. Sometimes being a bit more optimistic or far-fetched than what we actually got in the 21st century. But perhaps one of the most intriguing areas of Retrofuture lies within Japan. Specifically, the science fiction stories and films produced at the height of the Showa era. With the leaps and bounds being made through the space exploration of the 1950s and 60s, the threats in sci-fi stories for children of all ages often turned out to be invaders from other planets or bizarre monsters. And more often than not, they were at times invincible and seemingly unstoppable. But then, someone had the bright idea. What if mankind could fight back? Enter the age of the superweapon. High-tech MacGuffins and machines that could repel and sometimes defeat even the deadliest of kaiju and aliens. But amongst these early pieces of arsenal exists what many consider to be the pinnacle, if not the iconic anti-kaiju weapon, the Type 66 MASER cannon tank. This fearsome machine would go on to become one of the most recognizable vehicles of the Godzilla series, personifying the super science dreams of Japanese Retrofuture, as well as a franchise staple. There's an interesting history behind these deadly machines, filled with innovation, ambition, and unfortunately, a disappointing downfall. And I think it's high time someone shined a little bit of laser light on it. So, for Vintage Henshin, I'm Mike Dent, and at long last, I give you an ode to the MASER tank. To really examine the history of the MASER tank, we have to go back to the world of Japanese science fiction in the 1950s and 60s. In the pages of Shonen Magazine, Shonen Sunday, and other children's magazines, Japanese youth were enthralled by the outlandish illustrations and stories of a future that could be, fueled by the kaiju boom and the then ongoing space race. These multi-page spreads featured everything from air cars to high-speed trains and orbital elevators. Eventually, they turned to things like apocalyptic scenarios, with Tokyo either becoming a barren desert or a flooded paradise. And of course, there was alien invasion. Also worth mentioning, the day of the dreaded Dolphin Surface War. Now, one of the biggest names to come out of this time was a man who is considered to be one of the pillars of Japanese science fiction, Shigeru Komatsuzaki. An illustrator and author, he started working out on military technical journals before being pulled into science fiction art for young adult novels and children's magazines, as well as model kit box art. He's perhaps best known in the West for his work on the now legendary box art pieces for Imai's Thunderbirds kits, as well as the original Bandai kits for Kamen Rider and various Super Robot shows. One of his stories, Earth SOS, was even adapted into an anime series decades later, and it's one that I highly recommend tracking down if you can. Komatsuzaki's keen attention to detail made even his most fantastic of illustrations seem all the more realistic, and it wouldn't be too long before his work would be noticed by the right people at Toho Studios. Komatsuzaki landed a production designer gig for most of the Toho science fiction movies helmed by Ishiro Honda in the 1950s. In most cases, he provided mechanical designs, such as the Goten in the undersea battleship, or Atrigan as it's known stateside. The film itself being an adaptation of the novel of the same name by Shunro Oshikawa, as well as Komatsuzaki's own novel, The Undersea Kingdom. During his tenure at Toho, Komatsuzaki would come up with several of these significant pieces for the Type 66 MASER tank's foundation.
Give them the right.
Firstly, the Markalite FOP, or the Markalite Cannon from the Mysterians. The cannon is one of the first major Toho sci-fi superweapons, which includes the intrepid 24 rocket car from Godzilla Raids Again. Deployed via the Markalite gyro rockets, the cannons were humanity's trump card in the final assault on the Mysterian Dome. After the Mysterians, parabolic dish-based weapons became the order of the day, starting with the atomic heat cannons appearing in the loose Mysterian sequel, Battle in Outer Space, and especially the atomic heat ray guns from the original Mothra in 1961. While Akira Watanabe, Mothra's art director, is credited for making the heat ray guns, Komatsuzaki was also allegedly involved. According to said account, this was due to a personal invitation from Eiji Tsuburaya himself. Irregardless, Komatsuzaki was never credited for this contribution, though this still remains to be the second piece for the Maser tank's development. The last piece came in 1965's invasion of Astro Monster, the A-cycle raygun tanks. After our heroes learn of the Ladybird sound device's adverse effects on the invaders from Planet X, they launch an attack with these high-tech tanks to free the mind-controlled Godzilla and Rodan. Interestingly enough, the A-cycle raygun tanks themselves would later appear in select episodes of Ultraman in 1966. Well, appear both intact and in pieces. That same year, though, is when all of those pieces, including the atomic heat ray guns, would ultimately come together. Ishiro Honda once again joined forces with Eiji Tsuburaya for the sequel to Frankenstein Conquers the World, Frankenstein's Monsters, Sanda vs. Gaira, perhaps better known stateside as the War of the Gargantuas. The original script for the film featured the trademark clashes with the Japanese self-defense forces that fans had come to expect in Toho sci-fi movies. But Honda felt that the film needed something a little more special for its action sequences. The answer? Say hello to the Type 66 Maser Cannon, or the Beast Killer Maser Beam Car, as it's designated in kanji. Appearing in the first major clash between Gaira and the JSDF, the tanks were the heavy artillery of the military. Their arrival on screen meant that the stakes were high, as the SDF brass initiated Operation L, a barrage of maser and laser beam fire that nearly killed Gaira from the get-go. Had it not been for the intervention of Sanda, the movie would have ended right there. Ultimately, the tanks proved instrumental, driving both of the Gargantuas off the Japanese mainland and directly into the path of an active nature. Another Maser cannon would appear 2 years later in the climax of Destroy All Monsters, in which the exploration car of the Moonlight SY-3 would use miniature Maser cannons as well as a portable Maser drill in their assault on the Killock base. During this scene, it was stressed that the Maser cannons were definitely a force to be reckoned with, which is great. But then, in a moment of popcorn logic, you ask yourself the big question. What the fuck is a Maser? I mean, is it even stronger than a laser? To find that out, well, let's crack open some textbooks. The Maser, or microwave amplification by stimulated emission of radiation, was actually the predecessor of what we know today as the laser, or light amplified by stimulated emission of radiation, which was almost called the loser. Masers stem from a theory posited by Albert Einstein regarding the induction of atoms in an excited state to emit radiation in a proper frequency. So, instead of dealing with light particles the way a laser does, masers amplify microwaves, and overall, they don't really do a whole lot on the destructive side. In fact, it took a while for scientists to actually find a use for them, since up until recently, masers were only usable at cold temperatures or vacuum environments. Also, after its perfection, the laser was found to be a more practical alternative. These days, masers are mostly used for things like boosting low signal noise for radio telescopes and communications, as well as molecular spectroscopy. In fact, NASA's recent Curiosity Mars rover utilized a maser to send signals back to Earth. But this really didn't play into the War of the Gargantuas and Destroy All Monsters pushing for masers as their beam of choice. Long and short of it, it probably just sounded cooler, as opposed to the staple laser weapons that dominated science fiction at the time. The fact that it's even spelled differently in katakana also lends itself to this logic. But funny enough, it wasn't until decades later that an element of real maser science, specifically their use with colder temperatures, would appear in a Godzilla movie. But before I say anything else though, I'm gonna throw a disclaimer that I'm sadly not a science major, so I'm pretty sure I'm not doing this breakdown justice. To that end, check the card in the top right of the screen to watch a fun video that breaks down the history of lasers and masers, which helped me write this segment. In spite of any scientific inaccuracies, however, behind the scenes of the War of the Gargantuas, the Type 66 Maser cannon was still impressive as far as the crew is concerned. The Type 66 model was created by art director Yasuyuki Inoue and production designer Mutsumi Toyoshima. It used Shigeru Komatsuzaki's A-cycle gun's rear carriage and barrel as a base, and like the Mark-Light cannon and the atomic heat ray gun, utilized a similar parabolic dish. Several versions of the Type 66 were built for the final film, each of them at different scales for various shots. But the truly genius part of each of the tank props was the actual Maser beam effect. In the War of the Gargantuas, energy surges from the nuclear reactor on the back of the Maser cannon's trailer, pulsing through the tank's boom-like barrel before shooting out a 100,000-volt beam from the main dish. To achieve this effect, the Type 66 tank models were fitted with a special iodine quartz lamp, which would shine an extremely bright light to complement the beam's optical animation. But as Toyoshima recalled in interviews, Akinori Takagi found that the lamp was extremely finicky to work with, and unless they wanted to set the tank props ablaze, the lamp could only be used while remaining parallel with the ground. So to compensate, the main dish of the Type 66 was designed like a crane. The dish was kept fixed and leveled while the barrel would control its height. To better sell this, lights were fitted inside of the barrel to create a pulsing energy effect. There was the smallest margin for error. But sure enough, on the day, the lamp worked like a charm. As Toyoshima recalled in an interview for the fanzine Japanese Giants, people might look at it as just a made-up weapon in a monster movie. But we put our hearts into building it. When it worked perfectly on set, it was an emotionally satisfying moment for us. The hard work definitely paid off, as the Type 66 Maser cannons proved to be one of the most memorable parts of the War of the Gargantuas. In time, the Type 66 tanks were upgraded into the Type 70s, and made their grand return in 1972's Godzilla vs. Gigan. Now, with some minor yet colorful cosmetic differences, their appearance was met with great fanfare. The problem? They were slightly nerfed. No longer the indomitable superweapons they wore in War of the Gargantuas, the Type 70s were swiftly destroyed during the first major assault by Gigan and King Ghidorah. They would meet the same fate during Godzilla vs. Megalon 2 years later on a technicality. Because, well, Toho, along with other major studios at the time, and especially tokusatsu productions, were subject to the economic crunch caused by the oil shock crisis. Sponsors and investors who were reliable go-tos had started to trail off, meaning that the belt tightened on film and TV budgets. So to save on money, the newer Godzilla films of the 1970s had to start relying on stock footage for effect sequences, along with old props, which is more than likely the reason why the Maser tanks even reappeared in Godzilla vs. Gigan. It got even worse by the time of Godzilla vs. Megalon, a film that was already in dire straits, that had to rely on stock footage from Godzilla vs. Gigan to get through some of the bigger set pieces, including the appearance of the Type 70 tanks, shot for shot. For more on just how tight things were for both Megalon and Godzilla in the 1970s, click the card in the top right for a link to Kyodai Kino's Ultimate Kaiju Binge, which delves further into that bit of history. Nevertheless, the defeat of the Maser tanks in Godzilla vs. Megalon would mark their final appearance in the Showa Godzilla series. By that point, what had become known as the second kaiju boom had begun to die down anyhow, with the more human-sized and more affordable Henshin heroes taking the spotlight. As Japan moved into the 1980s, so did the landscape of science fiction. With advances in science and technology, along with films like 2001: A Space Odyssey and Star Wars, the optimistic retrofuture heralded by Komatsuzaki's illustrations dissipated to make way for much harder, grounded stories. This, combined with a boost in interest thanks to the 1970 Osaka Expo, resulted in the SF boom for Japanese film and television. Some of the highlights of this time remain classics today, like Message from Space, Nazca: The Valley of the Wind, Sayonara Jupiter, Tsuburai's adaptation of Star Wolf, which unfortunately was edited into the compilation movie Fugitive Alien.
He tried to kill me with a forklift. Olay!
Pretty much any anime produced by Sunrise throughout the 1980s, and of course, Space Battleship Yamato, the compilation film of which famously beat Star Wars at the Japanese box office in 1977. But with all these strides in science fiction, behind the scenes, Toho was itching to bring Godzilla back to life. In 1979, producer Tomoyuki Tanaka enlisted help from critics and the best and brightest of Japanese science fiction to formulate a new direction for the series. This spanned across several pitches, including the resurrection of Godzilla, which ultimately never saw the light of day. But the efforts weren't for nothing, though. Fans were so hungry for a new Godzilla movie, it even got to where a so-called Godzilla Resurrection Committee went as far as to deliver a 40,000 signature petition to Toho in 1983. So, in the wake of a revival festival event the same year, Toho gave them exactly what they wanted in 1984. The return of Godzilla undid the more fantastic elements of the franchise and went back to basics, delivering a story in the spirit of the original 1954 classic. Though, as made evident in the film's climax, the more things changed, the more they stayed the same. The climactic final battle with Godzilla and Shinjuku saw the launch of the high-tech flying fortress, the Super X, along with another special vehicle that looked a bit too familiar to fans: the Hyper Laser Cannon. According to the technical manuals, these tanks were weapons developed by the JSDF during the Cold War for air defense against intercontinental missiles, or ICBMs. And while they weren't exactly Maser tanks, they sure as hell had the same silhouette and look, right down to a quasi-parabolic array firing the beams. There's a strange kind of irony to their existence, as one of the initial points for what would eventually become the Heisei Godzilla series was that its stories and tech would stay more grounded than the 1970s. That did not last long. Beginning with Godzilla vs. Biollante, the Hyper Laser Cannons were replaced by what would become a familiar sight to the Heisei series, the first of the DAG, or Defense Against Godzilla Mecha, the MBT MB-92. Like the Hyper Laser Cannons, these were also originally designed for anti-missile defense, but these new 8-wheel drive tanks, dubbed the Type 92s, were far deadlier than their predecessors. They incorporated a plasma heat mirror system to generate the actual Maser beam, and instead of relying on the trailer truck arrangement of the Type 66, they were entirely self-sufficient and equipped with on-board helium cooling systems and generators. Its new compact configuration mirrored progress in technology, downsizing the once massive array into a smaller and more maneuverable weapon of choice. For the most part, the MB-92s were actually effective in their first outing against Godzilla. They joined the JSDF standard tank and air defense regiments to maneuver Godzilla into the Thunder control system. At least, they did until the movie suddenly remembered that there were supposed to be two monsters in the climax. Behind the scenes, both the Hyper Laser Cannons and the Type 92 Maser tanks were designed by art director Takashi Naganuma, who has since gone on record saying that the HLCs were among his favorite props to work on from the return of Godzilla. Meanwhile, the Type 92 Maser tanks from Biollante would return in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah in 1991. Godzilla vs. Mothra would see the arrival of the Type 93 Maser beam tank, as well as the Type 93 Maser attack aircraft, also nicknamed the Maser Helis. The Maser Helis are unique in that they're technically fighter jets, but they're more based on attack helicopters at the time, like the Apache. Both would see varying degrees of success in the SDF's clashes with Batra and Godzilla himself. Emphasis on varying. Defeats aside, the battle scenes that both of these new additions appeared in unfortunately carried with them some unintended consequences. Up till Godzilla vs. Mothra, the Heisei Godzilla series prominently featured these self-defense forces as the main anti-kaiju opposition. But then, following that particular film, they stopped showing up. According to a Brett Hominick interview with GMK and Heisei Gamera director Shinsuke Kaneko, in Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and vs. Mothra, the SDF was there. But in Mothra, the SDF attacked Mothra. A little girl asked the SDF, "Why did you attack the good monster?" So the SDF stopped cooperating with Godzilla films. The lack of self-defense force cooperation left Godzilla without human rivals to try and stop him, a series staple that was now in jeopardy. At least, it was until somebody remembered a certain looming plot thread that no one had bothered to pick up. In Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, the story's climax features Mecha King Ghidorah, who managed to repel Godzilla while taking severe damage. But in the process, one of Mecha King Ghidorah's heads was lost, falling into Tokyo Bay. And according to the intro scenes of 1993's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, the people of the present found that head, and they ran with it all the way to the stars. Upon reverse engineering the leftover tech and realizing the world needs to step up against future monster threats, the UN founds the G-Force organization, a dedicated anti-Godzilla task force that was now being outfitted with all of the latest gadgets and weaponry to stop him. In creating G-Force as a self-defense force surrogate, the Heisei Godzilla series had opened the door for more ambitious science fiction concepts. Anything and everything was now on the table. Leading the charge alongside a new breed of Maser tanks was Mechagodzilla himself, or Mechagodzilla 2, or Super Mechagodzilla, depends on who you talk to. The first anti-kaiju mecha capable of sustained flight and armed to the teeth with large, high-power beam cannons. Super Mechagodzilla would be surpassed the following year with the second anti-kaiju robot, Mogira, based on the robot of the same name from the Mysterians, which technically wasn't canon to this timeline, don't think about it. Not only was it sleek and rocking several new weapons, it was a combiner! For all the over-the-top weapons and insane gimmicks, though, G-Force continued to hold a terrible track record from the JSDF. For whatever progress they made, they were almost always entirely wiped out by the end, usually due to Godzilla's Deus Ex horror movie luck. By Space Godzilla, the bar had clearly been raised as far as it could go, until it was brought down by the final curtain.
Godzilla 6.
The year was 1995, and Toho was looking to close the books on Godzilla with Godzilla vs. DESTOROYAH. Faced with cutbacks by Toho, effects director Koichi Kawakita and his team were left with a limited visual effects budget for what was supposed to be Godzilla's grand finale. After ramping things up over the last few movies, the decision was made to once again go back to basics. No giant robots, no over-the-top weapons. The only real twist was G-Force's various Maser tanks being retrofitted with ULT, or ultra-low temperature Maser capabilities, all designed to keep the new rampaging, burning Godzilla from melting down. Among the ULT weaponry were a few additions to the tank arsenal. Firstly, the CLT-95 freezing Maser tank. Designed by Shinji Nishikawa, the CLT-95 was originally conceived of as a successor to the atomic heat ray guns for Mothra vs. Bagan, the ill-fated sequel to Godzilla vs. Biollante, which had been cancelled following Biolante's performance at the box office. While most of that film was gutted out and turned into Godzilla vs. Mothra, the production team held off on utilizing Nishikawa's tank design in hopes of using it somewhere later. This ended up becoming part of the new G-Force freezing Maser counteroffensive. Nishikawa even modified the Type 95's dish to look like an opening flower, as a kind of revenge against Toho for changing his original Biollante design. But of course, while not extravagant, there had to be some new major superweapon to lead the charge against Godzilla. In the end, it was decided to simply bring back an old friend, in the best way possible. The Super X-3. Honestly, my favorite iteration. The Super X, which featured in both The Return of Godzilla and Godzilla vs. Biollante, was conspicuously absent for the rest of the Heisei series, so it was decided to bring it back, along with X2 pilot Sho Kuroki, for one final upgrade. The Super X-3 was loaded to the gills, along with cadmium and freezer missiles. The craft packed several layers of heat and radiation resistance, and its own high-power ULT MASER cannon. The ship also came in handy for the final battle of the film, in which it and the rest of the G-Force MASER Squadron successfully brought DESTOROYAH down. And when it was all said and done, Toho closed out the Heisei series on a high note. Now, the studio could rest easy, as they were handing the reins over to Hollywood.
All new American version Godzilla.
Who would surely turn out the best Godzilla movie ever.
That's a lot of fish.
Oh. Oh no. Following that, misstep, Toho took back the reins for what would become known as the Millennium series of Godzilla movies. No shared continuity apart from a few exceptions, everything spinning out from the original 1954 film in unique ways. And this was good news. Fresh new directors and talent would be coming on board with bold new interpretations. And surely, they'd have their own unique twists on our favorite mobile anti-kaiju superweapons. This is what we got. In the opening of Godzilla against Mechagodzilla, an operation to take on Godzilla in the midst of a typhoon goes horribly wrong. Because this new Godzilla is immune to MASER fire. Also, the new Type 90s get taken out because of rain-induced power loss. This trend continues throughout the rest of the movie and into the sequel, Tokyo SOS. Long and short of it, the further the Godzilla series and franchise went on, the more the MASER tank was simply left behind. The recent Godzilla Singular Point series on Netflix added insult to injury for this by having an Easter egg that saw a MASER tank crane and dish in the trash. To figure out just why the MASER tank was discarded, there's two perspectives you have to view things from. One strictly storytelling, the other real life. From the storytelling side, the MASER arsenal had officially hit a wall now. The shark had been more than jumped. I mean, where the hell do you go after humanity is able to make a giant flying robot? And that brings us into the real life perspective for why the MASER tanks have been left behind. They got boring. MASER tanks would initially show up alongside standard military vehicles in the bigger moments of combat. When they were rolled out, it meant that things were getting serious. But then, the MASER arsenal became all that there was. Until eventually, they just blurred into the background. What might have seemed like a great idea on paper ultimately ran what made the whole thing special into the ground. As both Godzilla and kaiju films overall move into the Reiwa era, it looks as though there really isn't any room for the MASER tank. They've simply become Retrofuture relics, a cliche that is a self-parody of sorts. But that's not to say they've been completely forgotten, nor has the nostalgia for them diminished. In addition to years of countless homages that are still going to this day, MASER tank props appeared, retrofitted, in several other Toho films and projects. There was even a MASER tank shoutout in Legendary's Godzilla King of the Monsters, albeit a slightly underwhelming one. You gonna give us MASER tanks instead of the goddamn flying room? While it may have been rendered as cannon fodder by the end of its career in the Godzilla series, the MASER tank has become engraved into the world of tokusatsu. They're iconic and inseparable from the pop culture conception of what makes a kaiju movie. And when you boil everything down, the reason for that, and why they'll never totally go away from the minds of fans, they're the remnant of an age of optimism towards the future. They're St. George rushing to fight the dragon on a steed of hyperscience. And most of all, they're that wonder that comes back to life whenever we see a kaiju attack on screen. Whether in memory or hopeful revival down the line. Long may they reign.
Let's see. Gamma vs. Monster X. Star Wars Holiday Special with commercials. Phantom of the Paradise, how did that get in here? Oh, here we go. And there we go. Now then, let's see what we've got for Season 2.